Okay, so you want to build the most powerful military headquarters in the world. You want the symbol of American dominance, the five-sided fortress on the Potomac, the nerve center of the most powerful war machine in human history. You think about the generals, the war rooms, the decisions that shaped the 20th century. Very few people think about the price tag, the men who laid the concrete, or what had to be demolished to make room for it. Here is the number that puts all of it in perspective. The Pentagon was designed, approved, built, and occupied in 16 months. Not 16 years. Not 16 months with unlimited budget and materials. 16 months, in wartime on a floodplain, without elevators, while a world war was already being fought. That is not an engineering footnote. That is the whole story compressed into a single fact. So here is the question nobody asks cleanly. What does it actually cost to build the world's largest office building in under a year and a half? And who paid the price that never appeared in any budget? The answer is not what most people expect. And once you understand it, you will see the Pentagon, and every symbol of national power that comes after it, in a completely different light. It starts with a Thursday afternoon in July 1941, and a general with a deadline nobody thought was possible. Before we can understand the Pentagon, we need to understand the crisis that created it. In the summer of 1941, the United States War Department was falling apart. Not from enemy attack, but from its own growth. 24,000 military and civilian employees were scattered across 17 different buildings in Washington, D.C. The headquarters was the Munitions Building on the National Mall, a temporary structure built during World War I that had never been meant to last. Staff had just been evicted from the ornate State, War, and Navy building next to the White House because Franklin Roosevelt's own staff needed the room. A new War Department building had just been completed. It was immediately too small. 3 weeks earlier, Adolf Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. Roosevelt had already declared a national emergency in May. The War Department's personnel count was projected to hit 30,000 by year's end, and the 17 buildings they occupied couldn't absorb that number. The fragmentation wasn't just inconvenient, it was a national security threat. The fix emerged on Thursday, July 17, 1941, in a meeting that lasted less than an afternoon. Brigadier General Brehon Somerville, the Army's chief of construction, summoned architect George Edwin Bergstrom, then president of the American Institute of Architects, and Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pat Casey, his chief engineer, and gave them a directive that bordered on absurd. Design a single building to house 40,000 workers, no more than 4 stories tall, ready to present by Monday morning. They worked through the weekend, and what they produced was shaped, partly by accident, by the roads already surrounding the site. The land was 5-sided. The building became 5-sided. By the time Congress voted to approve it, the House on July 28th, the Senate on August 14th, the design was already being refined. Ground broke on September 11, 1941. The world's largest office building had gone from a Thursday afternoon idea to a construction site in less than 2 months. That speed was the mechanism's genius. It was also the seed of everything that would go wrong. Let's run the actual numbers, because they are almost impossible to comprehend. The initial budget was $35 million. That figure was presented to Congress in July 1941 as the cost of a building Somerville described as roughly 4 million square feet. Both numbers were wrong, and Somerville knew it. He had quietly underestimated the building's true size, which would eventually reach 6.2 million square feet, to prevent Congress from rejecting the project on cost grounds. The first layer of real expense was the ground itself. The site sat on a Potomac River floodplain, with soil conditions so unstable that engineers had to drive 41,492 reinforced concrete piles into the earth before a single wall could go up. 2 retaining walls were needed to manage elevation changes, ranging from 10 to 40 feet across the site. The subsoils, engineers would later discover, were expected to continue sinking for another 50 years after completion. Steel was the next constraint. The country was already at war in all but formal declaration, and steel was a strategic material. Somerville's solution was to build without it wherever possible. The Pentagon's skeleton is not steel. It is 435,000 cubic yards of reinforced concrete. The 680,000 tons of sand and gravel required were dredged directly from the Potomac River, cutting transport costs while solving the problem of where to source aggregate on a wartime construction timeline. Ramps replaced elevators to eliminate the need for steel-reinforced shafts. Copper and bronze were stripped from the materials list entirely. Concrete pipes replaced metal ones. Every substitution saved steel for ships and tanks. Every substitution also produced a building whose infrastructure would begin deteriorating almost immediately. Then came December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not slow the Pentagon's construction. It accelerated it. By March 1942, over 13,000 workers were on site. At the project's peak, 15,000 people were working 3 shifts around the clock, the site lit by floodlights through the night. Somervell used the post-Pearl Harbor emergency to add a 5th floor to the building mid-construction, a decision that was never formally authorized before ground broke and that increased the building's size far beyond what Congress had approved. The budget jumped by more than $14 million after Pearl Harbor alone. Safety practices in the rush were sometimes fatally lax. 8 workers died on the site by August 1942. The total construction cost, depending on which accounting you use, ran between $63 million and $83 million. Using the $75 million figure most historians cite, and anchored to modern construction wage rates, the building cost the equivalent of roughly $1.4 billion today. The initial $35 million budget had been exceeded by more than double. To put the final scale in context, the Pentagon has more than 3 times the floor space of the Empire State Building. The United States Capitol could fit inside one of its 5 sides. It contains 17.5 miles of corridors. At full wartime occupancy, 33,000 people worked inside it every day, and it was thrown up in 16 months on land that wasn't stable enough to support it. Here is the structural problem that nobody in 1941 fully solved. The wartime shortcuts that made the Pentagon possible were also deferred bills that would come due decades later, and the people who would pay them were not the ones who made the decisions. The building's structural flaw was baked into its conception. Every material substitution made to save steel or copper or bronze in 1941 produced infrastructure that was technically adequate for wartime, but not designed to last. Concrete pipes corroded. Wiring systems were installed to the minimum standard required. The heating, ventilation, and electrical systems were already out of compliance with federal building codes by 1953, a decade after the building opened. The pipes leaked sewage. Ducts were so deteriorated that maintenance workers could push a finger through them. Every day, overloaded circuits caused up to 40 local power outages inside the building. There were no passenger elevators. The 13 freight elevators were so poorly designed that they inflicted about a dozen minor head injuries per year from their guillotine-style doors. But the structural flaw that the numbers could not capture was human, and it had been built into the project from the beginning. The Pentagon was constructed under Virginia state law, and Virginia law in 1941 mandated segregated workplaces. The architects designed accordingly: separate dining facilities and separate bathrooms for white and black workers. The building was eventually planned with 284 bathrooms, twice the number required for a building its size, because the law demanded duplication. Roosevelt later ordered the segregated bathrooms removed, though he could not eliminate the separate dining facilities. The contradictions inside the building mirrored those outside it. Outside, a more permanent cost was being paid. The Pentagon did not just need a building. It needed a transportation system, 30 miles of highways, ramps, and cloverleaf exchanges, and 21 overpasses, to move tens of thousands of workers in and out each day. That road network required land. In early 1942, residents of a neighborhood called Queen City, a self-sustaining African-American community in Arlington, Virginia, were told they had 30 days to leave. Queen City was not an informal settlement. It had 218 homes, 900 residents, its own fire department, 2 churches, a grocery store, a barber shop, a gas station, and a trolley stop. Its original residents were descendants of Freedmen's Village, the Civil War-era settlement established by the federal government for freed slaves, who had themselves been displaced from that land in the 1890s. By April 1942, Queen City had been demolished. The Cloverleaf Interchange, where Columbia Pike meets Washington Boulevard, a piece of infrastructure so ordinary that most commuters pass through it without a thought, sits today on exactly the land where that community stood. Property was seized through eminent domain. Payments were made, though residents had no meaningful ability to negotiate their amounts. Government officials characterized the displacement as a minor inconvenience. The men of Queen City, many of them experienced bricklayers and laborers, were among those hired to build the very structure that erased their neighborhood. They worked in a building with separate bathrooms and separate cafeterias, building an institution whose stated purpose was the defense of American freedom. What came next was not a surprise to anyone who understood what had been built. It was arithmetic. By 1991, a pipeline break at the Pentagon released 7 million gallons of water into the building, nearly shorting out the electronic communication systems being used to coordinate with American forces during the Gulf War. By 1992, the building had been deteriorating for decades without a coherent maintenance plan, its concrete crumbling, its wiring ancient, its ducts full of asbestos. Congress authorized a complete renovation that year, initially budgeted at $1.2 billion, nearly the same cost in today's dollars as the building's original construction. The renovation program, known as PenRen, was expected to take 20 years. It eventually ran to $4.5 billion, fueled by the complexity of the problems workers found once they started digging. Studies during the renovation revealed that the floodplain subsoils were still sinking, exactly as engineers had predicted would happen when ground was broken in 1941. Lead paint covered the crumbling walls, asbestos filled the ducts, PCBs and mercury had to be removed before modern systems could be installed. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff met in their secure conference room, the tank, renovation workers were required to silence their jackhammers to avoid disturbing the meeting. September 11, 2001, added another chapter. A hijacked airliner struck Wedge 1 of the Pentagon, killing 184 people. The damaged section was rebuilt in the single fastest major construction project in the modern American military's history, a deliberate echo of the original 16-month sprint. The rebuilt Wedge 1 was operational in 12 months. The rest of the renovation continued around it, finally concluding in 2011. The total cost, roughly $4.5 billion, for a building that originally cost $75 million. Here is the honest ledger of building the Pentagon. On the asset side, the War Department was consolidated from 17 scattered buildings into one functional headquarters in 16 months, during an active global war, with a workforce that at its peak exceeded 15,000 people working around the clock. The logistical achievement was genuine. The building absorbed 33,000 workers at full capacity and remained operational as American military command throughout the war. It served as proof that the United States could mobilize an industrial and organizational machine at a scale and speed nobody had seen before. Those things were real. On the liability side, the initial budget was deliberately understated to avoid congressional rejection. The building was constructed with materials and to a standard that the people making decisions knew would not last. 8 workers died on the site. A community of 900 people was displaced in 30 days to make room for a parking interchange. The same institution tasked with defending American freedom built its headquarters with racially segregated bathrooms and cafeterias under Virginia Jim Crow law. And the deferred maintenance costs that accumulated over 50 years eventually required a renovation that cost more, in real terms, than the building itself. The Pentagon was not produced by villains or by a historical accident. It was produced by incentives. The system rewarded speed over durability, scale over equity, military necessity over the rights of the people who happened to live where the roads needed to go. Each decision was rational, given the pressure of the moment. Each decision externalized its true cost onto someone who had no voice in making it, the workers who died.